Hello again. Welcome back to Dog-Eared Thoughts. I'm Michael. I am so glad you're here. So we're going to jump into this episode 23, another deep dive on a book. So I was lucky enough to pick this one up at the library. It was part of my library haul a few episodes ago. So check that out if you want a reminder. And I'm definitely this year is definitely the year of the long book for me. I've managed between the Count of Monte Cristo and a few, and this one and a couple others. I'm definitely pushing the 500 page limit, absolutely, if not further. And this one is comes in at right around like 1,300 pages, or at least in the version I read. So it's called Shogun by James Clavell. It came out in 1975. It has been adapted twice, most recently on Hulu and FX, for those of you who have seen that. And I will say, I had watched that series. Absolutely, I thought it was amazing. I know it's gotten a lot of rave reviews, rightfully so. And so it got me interested in reading this book. And when I think back about this book, I remember growing up, especially in the 80s, whenever we would visit, whether it was a relative or just a friend's parents' house, things like that, Shogun was on the bookshelf. Like there was no way that was not going to be there. It was just one of those books that just fit on the shelf. Whether people read it or not, I don't know. Maybe it was a gift. Like who knows? But like it seemed to be one of those books that was just continually there. And so it definitely left an impression, just from a standpoint of A, it was a thick book, B, the typeface and everything was, one of those things that you just remember. And so as I settled into this, it was one of those things where I don't know that I would say that it was a gap in my reading, but it was absolutely a gap in terms of a book that I probably grew up with that I could absolutely have read in my teens or whatever age group. Although having read it, I don't know that I would have appreciated it as much when I was younger. So, but nonetheless, it's just one of those staple books that you're getting. And I think with the series coming out, it's got a resurgence in people wanting to read the book and getting a sense of it. So, absolutely worth. I think it was worth the read. I'm going to get into it a little bit about what I did and didn't like about it. But overall, I would say it was a solid 3 to 4 star, 3-star read for me, somewhere in between, right? So we'll go ahead and get into it and do a little bit of deep dive. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are. So put some comments down below, like, subscribe, all of those things, and we'll get on into Shogun. So, just kick this off, I guess we'll start off a little bit with James Clavell. Clearly, definitely saying that name wrong, but it's okay either way. And it's interesting. That's obviously a pen name, or at least a name that was for him. But from Sydney, Australia, at least initially, born there, was rated in the Royal Navy, and moved to England and was there when World War II broke out, and he enlisted there and was part of all of that. He was actually sent to the Pacific Theater and was captured. He was actually a prisoner of war in prison camp there. So it's kind of interesting. Last week we talked about Kurt Vonnegut and his time as a prisoner of war in Germany. Obviously, James was also a prisoner of war, just from the Japan side in Southeast Asia. And so, if you know of anything about prisoners of war during that time, especially in Southeast Asia, it was significantly bad. And a lot of people did not survive being a prisoner of war there. And so, that was definitely an area where obviously he did survive, but it definitely did a lot of how he responded and obviously left a deep hole and a deep reaction in terms of how he handled himself going forward, right? But coming out on the other side is it's interesting because he set this saga up of Shogun being one of the first in a multitude of books, which I think is called the Asian Saga, I think as it's called, and really kind of takes the time frame from like feudal Japan, which is where Shogun takes place, all the way through and even beyond to like the World War II, Vietnam War, etc. And so he clearly had a sense of kind of trying to tell this interesting story of how Japan, I guess, became where it was, or at least what he experienced of Japan in the war. And I would also argue that, you know, obviously there's a piece of that clearly shown throughout the book, in that, you know, look, the reality is that he writes it obviously a very Eurocentric, you know, character, is kind of the as Elise starts off to be the main character, an Englishman. You know, he does a good job of kind of blending, or at least making sure the Japanese aren't completely seen as villains. At least in this particular book, there's, you know, they are very much you know, a cross section of what you might expect out of that. But I think the other piece to it is that, you know, look, at the end of the day, he's viewing it from a lens that he experienced, which was not a necessarily high praise of what he felt the Japanese was coming out of World War II. And so, you know, from there, he obviously he went on to help. He came to the U.S., started in Hollywood as writing screenplays. He was one of the writers on The Great Escape, which another POW escape movie, which is interesting, you know, from that perspective, as well as other ones they're in there. And then from there, he turned to fiction as he kind of came into that. And while you certainly can read it from a chronological order, the Asian Saga didn't really start with Shogun. It wasn't the first book in publication order necessarily. He kind of went through King Rat and then Taipei and then Shogun. But the Shogun is by far probably one of the most famous. And if you're looking at it from a chronological, in-story chronological standpoint, this one obviously starts further back in history than anything else. Like the other ones are further along in history, and they don't all take place in Japan specifically, but they all have kind of Southeast Asian roots to it. So yeah, it is an interesting approach from that standpoint. And, you know, I think the way that Clavell kind of viewed this interesting story was that an Englishman goes to Japan and becomes a samurai, right? And how does that story unfold? And from there, he self-claims that, you know, he did a lot of research into what was kind of what we would say feudal era, or that time frame of Japan. He traveled there, he talked to historians, so he tried very hard to make it as accurate in terms as possible within that standpoint. And I think, you know, the way he wanted to view this was kind of how did the West and East kind of really come together in that time frame, you know, and kind of these very differing cultures, especially back then in Japan. How did that interact with these Europeans? Not only Europeans, but then you're also dealing with this kind of the Reformation, and is still fresh in everyone's mind. You know, the Spanish Armada, all of those things in that time frame is still going on, as well as just circumnavigating the globe, right? Like all of these things and the high edge of sea voyage, of who controls the seas and all of these things. But then you throw into this Japanese kind of coming out of isolation and into whatever this is, right? Well, what we would call it, what we from the European or you know, kind of standpoint is isolation. You know, for them it was clearly not. And so, you know, it was such a sprawling and kind of big epic story, you know, from that perspective, that it caught on very fast, and it was very popular. to the point where he Clavell won an award for in the American Japanese National Literary Award in late 70s related to that. And I think at that time, keep in mind even well past the post-war Japan, there was still clearly some some mixed feelings on both sides, from the Japanese, from Americans, obviously rightfully so, given the bombs that we dropped there, and then but rightfully so from the Americans to the Japanese, from Pearl Harbor and all the deaths that came from fighting through that war. So there was definitely a lot of different pieces to that kind of helped bridge, from that viewpoint, at least at that time in the 70s, kind of brought Japan back on the map in a positive way. It was kind of viewed as this might be a positive story of our culture and past, right? And so yeah, and the book has some basis of truth, right? There was a sense of the Jesuits and the initial Portuguese and Spanish who first came to Japan, and how that introduction of Catholicism kind of was accepted or not accepted in Japan, and all of the things that went into that. And then this particular one was, Englishman who arrives in Japan in the 1600s. That in and of itself was based on, in part, at least loosely based on a real person who went into and became part of Japanese culture from that perspective. So in and of itself was to the point where that person never left Japan, right, and never returned to England. So he used a lot of that in terms of forming the character of the main character, John Blackthorne, who is an English navigator, deeply proud to be English, and allied to the Dutch, who are fighting this, for lack of a word, holy war of Protestant versus Catholic and kind of controlling the seas of Portuguese and Spanish, and all of these things. So all of that comes into play into that. And then the Japanese feudal lords were all generally based on real feudal lords or people that existed in some way, shape, or form back then as well in the 15 and 1600s. So so all of that is, Japan is kind of becoming a bit of a state of, now that the English has shown up, now it's this, is the Portuguese going to be able to really hold on to their supremacy of trading into the East, and along with the Spanish, parts of that, are the English continues to, and I think historically well known that English continues to strengthen their navy from the 16 into 1700s and beyond, and kind of ruled the at least especially the Atlantic in that regard, and then into the Pacific as well. So there's a lot going on across the world from that perspective, but then you have this kind of very insular story of Japan, and of and how is that played as part of not only the larger political pawns of Europe, but then also on the other side of that, how is Japan using all of these, this new Englishman who is a different type of Christian than they're used to, how are they using them to kind of leverage understanding and how they deal with these Europeans that are now coming into Japan and creating an unbalance in the world that they are used to, right? And so all of that goes into this story, and I think it's good from a standpoint of, as a reader reading this, even if you're not fully understanding the history of that time frame, it does a good job of kind of coaching you through it, enough to understand, oh, okay, obviously the Protestants and Catholics don't like each other, a little bit of why, definitely understanding the control of the seas and pieces of that. And you, in and of themselves, as the reader, through Blackthorne's point of view, when you're reading his point of view, is kind of this immersion into Japanese culture and trying to understand not only the language, but just in general, the culture, the history, the nuance, obviously the aesthetics, the extreme change in what is can be considered moral or even medicinal change, food, like everything is just historically and culturally different from what you're coming from a Western Europe standpoint going into Japan. And I think my favorite piece is really like the doctors, right? Like how the expectation back then is that any doctor in Europe would just bleed you, and just take your blood and that'll cure you. Whereas, the Japanese doctors are much more kind of holistic and thorough and kind of truly, take care of you. Or even something as simple that we would look at now as baths, right? And like how they question whether baths are really healthy or good for you at first. But Blackthorn very quickly realizes like, oh yeah, this is the life, right? Like sitting in some warm water, getting clean, okay, I can get behind this, as opposed to kind of the where they were in Europe at the time, or especially coming off a long sailing voyage where access to baths was definitely not an option. Food was very red meat heavy. Maybe some fruits, but like it was very heavy food. Whereas obviously Japanese food is rice and fish and other, different pieces from that perspective. And so it definitely is a fun, interesting experience from the reader's point of view to kind of immerse yourself into this world and being this fish out of water, for lack of a better word or phrase, getting into that. And that really goes a long way in that standpoint. So absolutely enjoyed that piece of it. I think when the overall culture and building of understanding the cities, understanding the concept of honor in terms of samurai and ronin and bushido, the tea ceremonies, and all of those things, is very clear that Clavell did his research in regards to that. Like the way that this comes across is seemingly very very direct. I think the piece of that also then tends to trend to say, like, does this book have to be as long as it is? And part of it is yes. It absolutely does not feel very long as you're reading it, even though it is very long. It moves along at a very quick pace. You actually, at no point really, generally speaking, do you not know why things are happening or know what the end result is and the end game is trying to be in relation to that. So you're absolutely kind of focused on that. So I do think that all of that is really huge. And I think, it led to another reason why it's such a popular and kind of endearing book coming out of that, especially in the 80s. And then you throw in the miniseries in the 80s that came into that. Like it's an easy book to read. And it's an easy story to understand. And even if you don't really understand the Japanese culture, like it doesn't, you don't need to, as a reader, you don't need to be an expert in that to enjoy it, because it really kind of just flows really well. And it's a pretty obvious story. Like, it's a survival story for Blackthorn. It's a bit of a story of political wrangling with Toranaga, who is the main Japanese warlord that you're tied to, that Blackthorn gets tied to, and what is his claim for trying to not only maintain his power but also potentially become Shogun, at a title that they go into explain how powerful that title is, and all of the things that kind of, and the wrangling and strategizing that goes with it. Again, none of that is overly deep that you get lost in it, but it's also very interesting and it keeps you reading throughout that, for sure. I think looking through at this book through 21st century eyes, and especially coming on the heels of the adaptation in 2024 on the screen, it is absolutely 100% kind of the white point of view being lens of Japan, right? I would even argue that Blackthorn as a character trying to learn Japanese is a little bit of a butchery of the language, and I could, absolutely, didn't necessarily kind of land well, and I think also, each one kind of, every adaptation, every viewpoint comes from, a Western viewpoint, right? And even in terms of, whether or not the reading of it really lands if you are from the East or you're from Japan. Like, do you really, especially, does he butcher the language? And I think in a lot of ways, obviously, I'm not a Japanese linguist, so I will not say how far off or not off it was, but there's definitely a lot of different articles out there about whether or not did he really, for all of Clavell's research into that, how much did he kind of flub or flex the general wording and phrasing that kind of came out of that. And I think part of that is okay and forgivable if you're looking at it from a standpoint of a Englishman trying to figure out how to speak Japan, and it's supposed to be incorrect and not really get it well. But at the same time, if the issue is that these Japanese lords are not doing a very good job of using the right wording, that gets into that, right? And so so that definitely fits into that. The other piece that, for me personally, as I read this book, what I struggled with was a little bit of a, for lack of a better word, Mary Sue, viewpoint for both Blackthorn and Toranaga, in that I never really felt like either of their lives were in danger throughout the course of this book. I also felt the ending, it was clearly building up to whether one battle or multiple battles and things that were going to happen. The end of the book just kind of rushes through what you would expect to see, and even by the time, as I was realizing how little was left in the book, wondering whether or not we were going to get anything, and sure enough, like, it didn't quite land as you felt like it might be building up to. That doesn't mean that the ending wasn't satisfying. It just was just kind of an interesting approach to that. It also, a general sense that when you look at Toranaga's character, he's just so 5 steps ahead of everybody in a lot of cases that you just kind of blend, like, okay, is he I mean, it's fine that he's that good and that smart and that kind of overwhelmingly going to win or whatever, but at the same time, I think it leaves a little bit to be desired on whether or not that lends itself to a good character from a standpoint of, like, I don't think he's ever going to lose. Like, what do we, what are the stakes on that? That being said, I think some of the main, the women characters in this were absolutely, I think, good. I felt like, they really nailed Mariko, who's kind of the main female kind of, not only do you get a point of view character, but also just in general kind of how she fits into both Toranaga and Blackthorn and others. And while the way that the character arc goes was incredibly interesting, I think it obviously telegraphed how her character ends at the end of the novel a little bit, like you kind of saw it coming, but that didn't make it land any less emotionally or impactfully. And quite frankly, I think the fact that her character continues to be a motivation of change, not only for Blackthorn and Toranaga, but also the priests and Jesuits. She was such a central character that even though initially you didn't think she was going to be, where she landed at the end of it was such an important character, and I thought that was really well done. And all of the things that go into that. One thing I did like about it as well is that I felt like Clavell did a really good job of making all the other sailors that Blackthorn sailed with as incredibly unlikable as possible, to the point where, when any of them die or as they go through and anything bad happens to them, like you're only just cheering it on. You're like, thank God I don't have to talk to about this person or hear this person's point of view anymore. And I think it kind of lands in terms of what you would imagine a bunch of people who think they know better going into this area comes out of that, and is rather despondent, but also just like not even willing to try to learn a culture that's not their own, or they don't try to understand it. So all of those things kind of factor into that, right? So yeah, so absolutely, I would say overall recommend it. I think it was really good. It'll be interesting to see how well it passes the test. Obviously, it's seemingly landed. It's been going on for 40 plus years as a book. Continues to be popular. They're still making shows about it, so clearly it's a popular one, and it will probably continue to be some. So it's good to kind of go into it with an open eyes and open mind. If you're looking at the Asian saga in and of itself, or it's from a standpoint of chronologically, at least, Shogun is where it starts. Then Taipei, which is based in Hong Kong, kind of in the mid 1800s. Gaijin is Japan in the later 1800s. King Rat, which was the first book that Clavell read, which was about being in a POW camp in World War II, and clearly was a personal tale for him, right? And then Noble House, which was kind of in Hong Kong in the 60s, and then we kind of head west into the last book, which is called Whirlwind, which is in Iran in 79, which was obviously a very topical time to be in Iran, and all the things that go into that. The general consensus is kind of going in chronological order in terms of the book stories, although quite frankly I don't know that it really matters. I don't know that all of them kind of intersect. There's so much time in between that even if any of these characters are related, they're so related, so many years between them that might be related, that it probably isn't necessarily as relevant, right? So yeah. So my final thoughts. I definitely think this was a great book. I think it was a worthy book. Absolutely would probably recommend it. I think especially if you're looking at, if it's on your TBR, on your bookshelf, wanting to get to it, definitely up there. It is a chunky book, but it moves fairly fast. But I can totally see why people kind of lose steam on it. And that being said, I'm not sure that I'm as set on reading any of the other books in the overall saga. I think this was a great place to end it. But we'll see. Who knows? Maybe sometime I'll grab one of the other ones as I see them and pick them up. So it definitely has a good. Has a lot of emotional weight, so check it out. It's not perfect, but what book really is these days in general, and you can always nitpick anything. So I think just knowing what you're going into and the viewpoint, I think, is important. So love to hear what your thoughts are. Jump on into the comments and let me know what you're reading or what you thought of Shogun if you've read it recently, and look forward to the next book that I'm going to read. So we'll see what that looks like. Until then, keep on reading and take care.